grandmother, Anna Lewis, she was very gifted. She used to take, one time women used long hair, and they used to cut their hair, and the jeweler, one of the jeweler stores would take the hair and give it to her. She would wash it, and then she had a stand about that high with a hole in the middle and pins all around, and she wove it. She'd make the most gorgeous watch chains, rings, flowers. She made, my sister has a picture that she made all these flowers, and she used to make a living for my grandfather, because he used to get 50 cents an hour for teaching Hebrew school. Grandfather came across first, and he landed outside of Pittsburgh, and there was a terrible flood in Johnstown, and so my grandfather picked up the family and moved up to Toronto. And there was one man and wife, she was getting ready for Pesach, and he fell off a ladder, and he got killed, and she was destitute. So my grandmother went from house to house, and she collected money to buy them matzahs and stuff for Pesach. And from that, they started the Federation. They started a society called the Women's Hebrew Aid Society.
When Jews started to come to Toronto, because there were no other foreigners. Jews were the foreigners, and they wanted to really assimilate the foreigners into the British tradition. So they did that through the church and encouraging the missionaries. And my grandmother was one of the first to start what they call a ladies' home, sewing circle.
My grandfather was a very sweet, quiet man, but certainly not a go-getter. And he would spend the whole day sleeping in the chair in the bay window in the dining room, and at night he would walk the beat with the local policeman.
And my mother tells a story that they always wanted to sneak in on your grandfather when he was asleep to see whether he slept with his beard under the covers or over the covers.
In fact, my grandmother once told me she was in love with her brother-in-law.
But I remember the heads of all the families, and how wonderful, for instance, Ruth Kossin was to his wife, who was my grandmother's sister in New York. We all laughed about it, but he used to take the cream off the milk every day for her.
He came to Philadelphia. He lived with his sister there. Then he went to Toronto. Very early on was a clothing peddler. Then he met someone. I don't know if it's someone he knew from the other side or someone here that got him interested in selling drugs. So they sold pharmaceuticals door to door. He and the oldest boys, Phil and Morris.
This is the original Kossin Drug Company that my grandfather started. It had to be about 1913. And it was in Harlem, around 110th Street or 112th Street, around that in Broadway. In the picture is my grandmother, Sarah Fagelah Kossin, surrounded by all her children. My Uncle Leon, my father, Morris Kossin, my Uncle Phil, my Aunt Minnie, my Aunt Tilly, my Uncle Ben, and Uncle Sam holding the youngest child was my Aunt Rahama.
County Drug, incidentally, was incorporated in 1926 by my father and my Uncle Morris. And the whole family's involved in this. How can I say? My Aunt Tilly was a secretary and the bookkeeper for the longest time. Uncle Carl and Uncle Ben drove trucks for a while during the vacation time. Uncle Leon used to come and buy his necessities there. Dr. Stanley Wershoff used to come. George Ticktin used to come and buy his stuff. And it was a thing that the family was just going in and out all the time.
Anna Ruth Ticktin. She married Saul Lewis, who they had 2 sons and a daughter. One was Abe, one was Charlie, my father, and there was my Aunt Ida Siegel. The oldest brother was one of these quiet, very quiet people. Lovely, lovely man. He lived in Albany. Ida Siegel and my dad were, well, how can you say it? They weren't dictators, but what they said, do it, you did it. My was the kind that was in the Navy and the Army and what do you call call these men that nobody, no, I know. No, he traveled around a lot. He was in the South African War. He was in the First War. He was any war he ran. He was one of these soldiers they call. No, he was, what you call him?
Mercenary?
No, I don't know. A gentleman soldier. There is a word for it.
Mercenary.
Well, whatever. I don't know. He got a citation from the King of Norway for that. He got a picture and a medal, and there's an invitation to go to Norway as their guest of the royal family at any time. And he was coming up to be into the Hall of Fame of baseball in Toronto. He ran for, we call them aldermans.
My mother, Ida Ticktin Lewis Siegel. My mother, Ida Ticktin, at the age 16. My mother was one of the few girls in Toronto of her crowd who did not go to work in the factories. She was very spoiled. My grandmother didn't make her go.
She was a woman who was very much ahead of her time. She was not an overly educated person. My grandfather didn't believe in girls having too much, but she had a tremendous drive for learning. And she used to go to the university and take courses at night. And she used to have a cute saying where she said, "I went through the high schools of Boston," meaning she walked through. She was the first Jewish woman elected to the Toronto Board of Education. She was very active both in Jewish and Gentile causes in Toronto. She was one of the original organizers of the Home and School, which is like the Parents Association. She was on the Jewish Board of Education, National Council of Women, Toronto Hadassah, you name it.
At that time, Canada was very British. And if you weren't British, you were a foreigner. And she felt that it was absolutely terrible that we didn't have a flag of our own. So I remember she told me that they had a little demonstration in one of the public parks. And they unfurled what they called to be a Canadian flag. And the policeman picked them up. And they said that was seditious.
My father, Isidore Hirsch Siegel, came to Toronto by way of Boston. He originally started out to go to Israel, or Palestine at that time, and they were not allowed to land, so the boat turned around and they dropped him off at Boston.
But then he found out that the family that had come from his village was in Toronto, and that family was the Ticktin-Rittenberg family. And so he came to Toronto and fell in love with Ida Lewis.
They were building the Trans-Canada Railroad at the time that he arrived there. And so he bought merchandise. They would buy merchandise, about 5 or 6 men get together. They would buy merchandise, put packs on their back, take snowshoes, and they would trek from one mining camp to the other, selling socks and coats and underwear and things like that to the miners and to the people who were building the railroad. And while he was up there, he would come across trappers and hunters, and he would buy skins from them. And so he bought muskrat skins and lamb skins, and he brought them back to Toronto, and he had fur coats made for us.
Kaimisha Lake.